So Weston Sprott is Dean of the Preparatory Division at Juilliard, leading the Juilliard Pre-College and the Music Advancement Program. He's also been a trombonist in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra since 2005. His work includes performance, education, administration, and thought leadership. He's an active speaker, writer, and consultant for diversity and inclusion in classical music, regularly presenting at conferences and contributing to musical publications. He's a recipient of the Sphinx Medal of Excellence and the Atlanta Symphony Talent Development Program's Aspire Award. So yeah, welcome, Weston. Thanks for agreeing to share your evening with us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So we, among some of the faculty, we've been thinking about questions we might ask, and so people will jump in, and students, of course, and guests are welcome to jump in as well. But I thought maybe we could start off by talking about your views about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the orchestra, since I know that it's a topic that you've spoken a lot about.
Sure. Yeah, that's something that's obviously very near and dear to me. That was my entry point into kind of thought leadership about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Of course, I'm a dean of the preparatory division at the Juilliard School, but I started in that position in May 2019. And I started my job in the Met Orchestra in 2005, which this would have been my 16th season had we had a season. And prior to that, I was principal trombonist in the Pennsylvania Ballet and the Delaware Symphony while I was still a student at the Curtis Institute of Music. So I've been playing in professional orchestras since probably 2004. And this whole idea or thought about there being marginalized communities and people who are thought of differently started for me at a very early age. I grew up in Texas playing in just my high school band and high school orchestra, and I was one of only a few African American students in those ensembles. Um, I had a pretty interesting trajectory. I won't give you the entire story, soup to nuts about it, because it would just take too long. But I think one of the interesting things is that I joined the Met Orchestra when I was 22 years old, which is by most accounts would be a very fast trajectory to get into an orchestra of that level. But if you rewind only 5 or 6 years before that, or maybe a few more, when I was in ninth and 10th grade in high school, I wasn't even in the first band, the top band in my own public high school, which is interesting to me. And so we would have these experiences where we would audition for different ensembles within our own high school. And I would find myself placing second chair in the second band. And then my sophomore year, I was first chair in the second band, that type of thing. And we also had these all region auditions where you could go and compete with students from all over the greater Houston area, and then eventually to students from an entire section of the state of Texas and the entire state of Texas. And I was having these experiences where I'd be ranked from a blind audition fourth in the entire Houston area, a metropolitan area with 5 million people. And, and they would have these auditions behind the screen. And I was thinking to myself, how is it possible that I'm the fourth best player from behind the screen in a city of 5 million people? And people don't even think I'm the fourth best player in my own public school. And I started having this experience multiple times. Eventually, it started to work out my junior and senior year because you reach a level where certain things are undeniable. But I also remember at the end of my junior year of high school, I went to my first ever professional orchestra concert to see the Houston Symphony perform just by chance. And Greg, you'll appreciate this. The first orchestral concert I ever heard was Mahler Symphony Number 3. Because Tim Higgins is one of my classmates who's the principal trombonist now at the San Francisco Symphony. And he said, "Hey, Weston, the symphony is playing this piece. I heard it has a really cool trombone solo. You should probably go check it out." And so I said, "Okay, I'll go check it out." So I asked my dad if he would get us tickets to the concert. We went to the concert and we heard this thing. And that was my light bulb moment where I went, "Oh, that's the thing. I've got to do that for a living. This would be the greatest thing ever to do." And I remember at that concert, there were no Black people in the orchestra. And I think my dad and I were the only Black people in the audience. And it wasn't lost on us that that was the case. It didn't discourage me at the moment from doing this, from pursuing this career path, but it was just something that was on my mind. And then when I went on to college, I recognized that you were very much in the minority, even much more so than you are in the general population. And then when I got into orchestras, most of the orchestras that I played in when I was in Delaware and Pennsylvania Symphony, or Pennsylvania Ballet, I was the only Black person in the orchestra. And when I got to the Met, I was one of only three. And so you start thinking about these things, and you meet all these friends along the way, and you hear about all the different experiences they're having, and not only the difficulty they have getting through the audition process, but how they're treated once they're in the orchestra. And you start to recognize a lot of patterns. And you see those patterns. For me, the pattern that I had is that even to this day, I think I can say correctly that I have never won an audition where the screen was not up from start to finish. It's never happened for me. But I can think of many auditions, whether it was Pennsylvania Ballet or Delaware or the Met. All of those auditions that I won were ones where the screen was up from start to finish. They actually told me that I was the winner of the audition before the screen came down. And so I started thinking to myself, there are patterns here, and I'm recognizing those patterns even when I speak to my other colleagues from underrepresented ethnicities. And I also recognize that being a member of the Met Orchestra, suddenly you have a bit of a platform to be able to speak your truth about things. And I've just seen over the years so many people who had a platform, opportunity to say something, and they didn't do it. And I thought, I should do this. So my friends and I, we started writing articles about this. We would speak our mind every time we had an opportunity. Someone wanted to feature you in a master class or the International Musician or whatever it happens to be, to get your thoughts about any number of things. You know, because after you win a major audition, a lot of people want to talk to you about, well, how do you win an audition? How do you prepare your excerpts and all those other things, which that's very, very important, of course. So I would go through all of that, but I would also make sure to include that there's two sides of this. There's a side where a musician has to prepare, and there's also a side where an orchestra has to be willing to accept someone who has prepared really well. You know, it's not just a matter of if only people prepared better, they would get more jobs or get better jobs. There has to be another effort on the other side of people being willing to be open to people who are not like them being a part of these organizations. There's a responsibility on the other side. And so I started using the platform, what little platform I had, to speak my truth on a regular basis. And over time, that began to evolve to, you're not just writing a blog posting on your own website, but people are taking notice of that, and they're asking if they can write articles or do interviews about it, or have you come and speak at the ROPA conference or the ICSOM conference or League of American Orchestras, things like that. So that's kind of the entry point to my work in orchestral diversity, equity, and inclusion. And over time, I've had the good fortune of that evolving into just more than talking points, but actually into projects. So a handful of years ago, the Sphinx organization, in conjunction with the League of American Orchestras and New World Symphony, launched this project called the National Alliance for Audition Support that was supported by a $1.8 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. And some of my colleagues and I were at the center of being thought leaders for that project and helping that grant go through, helping to design that program. Just this year, we actually launched our first ever Sphinx Orchestral Partners auditions excerpt competition, which I'm really, really excited about that. Basically, what we did is we hosted a real excerpts competition with grand prizes in different categories, one that's brass and percussion, one that was woodwinds, and one that was strings, with grand prizes. But also we were able to get over 70 American orchestras to commit to partner with this. And one of the stipulations of their partnership is that they would guarantee at least 1 week of work in their upcoming season to a player who competed in this competition. And this is a competition that's exclusive to people from African American and Latin American backgrounds. So I'm really excited about, it's no longer just a possibility, but the reality that in this upcoming season, when we all hopefully come back and we're able to be on stages again, that there will be no less than 70 weeks, and preferably more than that, where more African American, Latin American musicians will be gracing the stages of American orchestras. A couple of other things that I think are worth mentioning are, back in 2018, I was on a council for the International Conference of Symphony and Opera Musicians, and we were able to get ICSOM, as it's called, to make a resolution or adopt a resolution that blind auditions would be considered best practice for orchestras, which I thought was a significant step. And I have a lot of thoughts on the blind audition process. In fact, I don't think that blind auditions are a fix or is a fix all. I don't think it's the one thing that's going to solve issues of diversity in orchestras. I think it's one piece of a larger puzzle, but I do think it's an important one. And also, I'm just excited about all of the various conversations, very much like this one, that are happening on a really regular basis because no one has a monopoly on good ideas. And the more people are talking about these things and the more the conversation is expanded and people are doing good work, more good ideas are going to come out and more initiatives are going to come out as well. So I hope that answers the question to start.
That's
Yeah. Hey, Weston, thank you. So I don't want to get too deep into specifics on it, but I play in the Albany Symphony, and our executive director there, Anna Kuwabara, has worked with you some through the Sphinx, and we're adopting most of those policies for our audition process. And historically, we've always had fully blind auditions. We've picked a winner without the screen going down, and there's no trial. There's no trial period. Someone's offered a job every audition. What's the next step? What else can we do after that?
Sure. There was an interesting set of articles this past summer. One came out from Anthony Tomasini in the New York Times that said something to the effect of, in order to increase diversity in orchestras, we should end blind auditions, which I thought was, I was not a fan of that article, obviously. And so a couple of months later, there was another article that included thoughts of a lot of different people about what their thoughts on the audition process should be. And I teamed up with a handful of my colleagues, Alex Lang, who's the principal clarinetist of the Phoenix Symphony, Titus Underwood, who's principal oboist of Nashville, and Joy Payton Stevens, who's a cellist in the Seattle Symphony. And we co-authored a spot in the New York Times about what we thought should be the process or elements of the process. So there's a lot of statistics that would show that the blind audition process over the course of the last 50 years has really been influential in changing the demographic makeup of orchestras with regards to gender. It wouldn't take just a quick side-by-side. I'd encourage anybody to go back and look at this video of Stravinsky conducts Stravinsky of the New York Philharmonic. I can't remember when it was, but if you go back and look at that video, there's like this slow pan of the orchestra as they're playing Firebird. And you see exclusively white men in the orchestra, only white men, with one exception. There's the harpist in the very back. There's one female on the stage. That's it. And if you fast forward to basically any major orchestra in America now, you'll see a pretty significant difference in the makeup of those groups. In fact, now we're at about 50-50 male-female representation in American orchestras, which I think is great. Now the question is, why is that not translated into diversity as far as ethnicity? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think what the next step is to your question is to think a little bit more comprehensively about our audition process. I think the blind audition is one part of the audition process. That is the part of the process where you can help determine, and I'm stealing the language from my friend Alex Lang, musical athleticism. That's what that part of the process determines. Who can play the highest and the loudest and the softest and the slowest and with the most correct style and not miss the notes and play really well in tune with a beautiful tone throughout all registers, or any number of other things that we determine would help determine if someone is really qualified to do the job. Does someone understand the difference in style between Wagner, Mahler, Strauss, Bach, and Mozart, or whatever it happens to be? But it's interesting to me that every orchestra in America basically has the same hiring process. If you want to be in the Albany Symphony, or you want to be in the New York Philharmonic, or the New Mexico Symphony, or wherever, as a trombone player, the job is basically play Tuba Mirum, Bolero, Ride of the Valkyries, Hungarian March, William Tell Overture, first movement of a solo, probably David or Grandal, whatever happens to be. And the level of competition may differ if you're at your local symphony orchestra versus whether you're at the Philadelphia Orchestra. But beyond that, for all intents and purposes, there's no difference in the job description, which to me is insane. Right? So, I mean, there may be several tech companies out there, but I would be really surprised if the hiring process for Apple, Google, and Microsoft are exactly the same. So every community is different and has determined, and every orchestra is different in some ways. They have to determine what are the differences there. And how do we want to serve our community through those differences, and how will those differences inform our hiring process? So I could imagine, I'll just use an example, and I'm speaking on something that I don't know perfectly clear, but say, for example, we were to take an orchestra like the Memphis Symphony Orchestra. I'm just using this as an example, and if someone is in that orchestra and knows that I'm wrong about some things, then they can correct me later. But we would say that Memphis is a city that is, by American standards, majority minority. I think it's over 50% Black. I can't imagine that that orchestra plays the bare three pieces and things like that very often, but they might put it on their repertoire list. I imagine there's as much as they do symphonic standards, the traditional concert week, they probably also do family concerts, education concerts, community concerts, things like that. Is that reflected in the audition process? What are the things that are necessary to do that job? Do you need to be qualified to speak to students, to speak to different community leaders? Do you need to be comfortable going into a Baptist church in your community and being able to authentically engage with people who are in that space? Do you need to be part of the fundraising mechanism? Do you need to be qualified as a chamber musician? Any number of things. And what those things are will be different if you're in the Metropolitan Opera than they will be if you play in the Memphis Symphony or the River Oaks Chamber Orchestra or whatever it happens to be, any number of groups all across the country. But the question is, does the hiring process reflect those differences? So I agree, obviously we all have to be qualified to play the job, but being qualified to actually execute the notes and the rhythms in the appropriate style, demonstrate great musical athleticism is only one element of the gig. And are we doing the appropriate things to judge those other things, which could be any number of things and will be different for every single orchestra? That could be there's some element of an interview process. It could mean that there is a time where they want you to go into a school and demonstrate your ability to work with students. Any number of things, right? And then there's also the side of how are we recruiting people to our organizations, because there's the process and there's also getting people involved with the process. There are a lot of people from historically marginalized communities in the classical music space who honestly have no interest in playing in orchestras. And it's not because they don't love Mozart 40 or Schubert 9. It's because they don't like the idea of being in a space that has been historically unwelcoming towards them. And in fact, I know several musicians who are just phenomenal musicians, African-American musicians, who have joined the ranks of great orchestras, played in them for a couple of years and thought, I think I'm going to quit. I want to quit. I don't want to play here. And in fact, I can tell you, because I'm comfortable saying it now, but I almost quit the Met Orchestra my second year in the orchestra. And I remember calling Nitsan Haros, who was my teacher, and he kind of walked me off the ledge. But I said, I don't like the working environment. I don't feel like I'm treated very well here. I don't feel like I can be myself in this space. I think I'll just quit and do something else. At that point I was 23, 24 years old, and my thought was, I'm still really early in the game. I could just do something completely different if I wanted to. I mean, in hindsight, I'm glad that I didn't. But the point is that there are a lot of people who make that calculation for themselves. And so orchestras, in addition to adjusting their hiring processes, need to think about how do we create a space for people who are talented enough and qualified enough to get through our gauntlet of a hiring process. How do we treat those people when they're here so they want to stay? Because I'm a personal example of someone who was this close to being out. So I hope that kind of leans into the question. And Jill, I see you have your hand up. Good to see you, by the way. Oh, you're muted, Jill. Sorry.
Hey, sorry about that. Yeah, it's great to see you. I'm enjoying so much hearing you talk about this stuff. And I just had a couple of questions that maybe I should wait to ask them. But when you just talked about a more holistic look at hiring musicians for orchestras, and I'm remembering being in Polisi's class and talking a little bit about the artist citizen. This was a long time ago now, but I'm wondering also, we're living in a society with such enormous inequality of wealth, asset, and opportunity. And I'm also affected now I'm seeing it from the other side now because I have 2 kids now, and we're starting them on instruments, and it takes so much time, right? And to have time, you need some money, like you need assets, you need to pay a teacher, you need to it requires so if we in other countries there's a more robust public sector investment in the arts education. I'm referring to Western Europe in particular. I'm just wondering how quickly do we get into these structural issues and this deficit of education and the opportunities that are, it's what you're speaking to also in terms of raising musicians to be people who write well, can communicate well, are comfortable in a room with speaking to it seems to me also, and this now I'm a bit scattershotting, but the social studies curriculum I'm observing my kids go through is so limited in terms of its looking at these issues. So when you look at what can be done here in terms of, do we relax some of these, standards of just like practicing your etudes forever? Do we need more writing classes? Do we need more emphasis for what a musician is? How do we practically, it seems to me we get into political change here in terms of investment in society really quickly, right? In terms of solving these issues.
Yeah, I think there's obviously this infrastructure issue in our country where we don't have enormous governmental support of the arts, which is a shame. So many of us are suffering the results of that right now. I can tell you that, your wife is a member of the Met Orchestra. I'm a member of the Met Orchestra. We know this story really well. And that's at the top end of the totem pole by a lot of standards, And so how does that affect your average young person who is from an under-resourced community that doesn't have access to instruments? So I agree we need greater investment. I have the good fortune of leading the Music Advancement Program, which is this beautiful program that serves students who are from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds in classical music. And there are a lot of other programs also. So, unfortunately, not enough programs to serve every single student who has a need. But for students who want to have some degree of access to classical music, at least in New York City, which is a place that traditionally, at least over the last 30 years, has not historically supported music in its public schools. In fact, the reason why the Music Advancement Program came into existence was in response to a cut in funding in New York City public schools by Joe Polisi. He responded to that by helping to create this program. But there are places for students to get some of this education and get access to these programs. Now, I think once you get past that initial step, it doesn't necessarily mean that all these students have access to the highest quality instruments, which is problematic. But I do think, as far as getting people started, there is that element of, do you have enough? There's, I can't remember which book it was that I was reading years ago, but it was talking about grandmasters in chess, and it was relating to their IQs. It might have been one of these Malcolm Gladwell books, I can't remember. But at any rate, he was basically saying, we would assume oftentimes that grandmasters in chess have these extraordinary IQs, but the studies show that your IQ only needs to be just high enough. And I think we want to provide the absolute best to all of our students, but one of the things that I try to make sure is that we make sure that they actually have enough, that if they're putting in the time and the effort and they want to do it, they can reach where they want to be. And also, it's one of the things that I preach a lot with our parents and our students is that finance is one part of equity, but one of the biggest equity issues that I've seen over the years, and something I thought about even as I was a child, because I remember my mom being really upset with a teacher who I think was not a believer in my own abilities. All right, was the idea of equity of expectation, that no matter who you see in front of you, if you're a teacher or a leader of an organization, that you believe that the sky is the limit for them. So one of the things that I share with the parents in our program, and specifically the parents in the Music Advancement Program, is I believe the idea that your child is the next Yo-Yo Ma or Wynton Marsalis or Leontine Price or whoever it happens to be, That creates no cognitive dissonance for me, and it should create no cognitive dissonance for you either. And I want our teachers to believe that, and I want our teachers to push our students with the belief that it doesn't matter what neighborhood you're from, you're capable of achieving the exact same things as anybody else is. And I think you might be surprised at how far that takes you. Because I think a lot of people have been subjected to the idea that they're not capable of certain things, and they've been taught by people who have already lowered the bar for them and thought, oh, because you live in this neighborhood, or because your instrument is not of the highest quality, or this or that, we can only get you to this level, which that is not the case at all, and we've proven it time and time again already. So I think quality instruments and all that stuff, making sure that every kid has a computer, all the things that we think of in a traditional sense of equity is really important. But equity of expectations, both for the students and from the teachers, I think has enormous value. So, Rami?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to take a pivot a little bit, I guess, to focus on diversity and equity within the canon of like the repertoire we play. And I know a lot of us, having gone through pre-college or youth orchestra type programs, that's an extremely formative time when you start building musical opinions and things like that. And you're also, potentially preparing for college auditions that require certain awareness of the canon, et cetera. So I was just curious what kind of things you guys are thinking about in the prep division at Juilliard in terms of shaping some of these changes for repertoire and a more diverse landscape of repertoire in what the students play and what they prepare.
Sure. So I started my position at Juilliard in May of 2019, and for all intents and purposes, I really started in the 1920 school year. So I got a nice 7 months in the building before the world fell apart. but in that time, one of the very first things that I did is I talked to the leaders of our different ensembles, our orchestras and our choruses and our wind ensemble, and I said, one of the things that I want to see, especially because we're not a major orchestra that's doing 40 different programs a year. In pre-college, an individual orchestra might play 3 concerts a year, 3 orchestra concerts, and so we made a standard practice that all of those concerts would include at least one piece of repertoire by someone from an underrepresented community. That would be Black, Latino, female composers, et cetera, et cetera. So even last year, we had Anna Klein in the building for a piece. A couple weeks ago, I was walking through the halls, and one orchestra was playing Samuel Coleridge Taylor, another was playing William Grant Still, and so we've been doing a lot of work in that area. One of the silver linings of COVID this year was that with these different online classes, we were forced to kind of reinvent the way that we think about how we engage our students with the curriculum. And so Juilliard adopted a block system where we actually extended the school year to 36 weeks. And block 1 was a 7-week period where there was no in-person activity. Everything was online. We've been doing some in-person work for the last 15, 16 weeks, actually, which has been fantastic. But we launched this course called Expanding the Canon Underrepresented Composers. And every kid in our program, all 380 of them, took this class. And it was a 7-week course. The first 2 weeks was with Jane Gottlieb, who leads our library, and she was basically teaching them how to engage with repertoire, how to research things, how to look for stuff, how to learn more about it. And the next 5 weeks were taught by Trevor Weston, who is a composer that's on our music advancement program faculty, teaches theory and ear training. And they just basically covered a century in each class. It was very much a survey course where they would start with 12th century Hildegard of Bingen, and then they would move on to a different group of composers in 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. Angelica Negron was one of the guest artists for the class. She came in and spoke to students. And basically, with each class, Trevor would go through and say, all right, here are 5 or 6 really fantastic female composers, Black composers, Latin composers, Middle Eastern composers from the 18th century that I think you should be aware of. We're going to listen to 3 or 4 minutes of a handful of their great works. Here's your assignment for next week. I want you to write something about them, listen to these pieces. And the end result of that was that after those 7 weeks, each student was given their final assignment to list 3 to 5 works by composers from underrepresented categories that you particularly like, that you've listened to, and write something about all of them. And we ended up with a list of well over 400 works that were recommended by our students that they would like to play and that they find interesting. In the meantime, I've been talking to some of our individual faculty members about creating lists of their own that they think will be suitable for juries and recitals for students at the pre-college level. Because, of course, it's one thing to have pieces that are suitable for members of the New York Philharmonic or the LA Phil. It's another thing for students who are in the formative stages at 14 years old. What can they play? And what's actually useful for their development, their educational development at that point in time. So we're having that conversation, and you've actually prompted me a little early because Liz, I don't think this has gotten to you yet, but it will be. We're in the midst of launching a pretty significant commissioning project as well, because in addition to having our students making lists and thinking about these works and our faculty thinking about those also, I want all of us to have some skin in the game. So we're looking to commission works on every single instrument in the pre-college, solo works by a very diverse and inclusive group of composers that will be specifically written at the level of the pre-college entrance audition. So that challenges students at that level. And then doing a very similar commissioning project in the music advancement program, we're going to hopefully get a series of etude books on every single instrument that are in alignment with the learning outcomes that we have designated for each year. So music advancement program is a 4-year program. We have predetermined learning outcomes for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And we want to create etude books that are 8 to 12 etudes, where 2 to 3 etudes represent each level. And for us, our learning outcomes in the 4th year are the same as the entry auditions for the pre-college. So there should be a nice bridge where students can feel like, not only am I getting to work with new work, but that new work is written by people who are reflective of the communities that are represented in our programs. That new work is written at a level that's actually suitable for where I am in my development. And it also gives our opportunity for our faculty to be involved with the process also. Because one of the things that I've noticed in all these conversations over the last year is we have a lot of conversations and a lot of talks about how we feel and what we think. And one of the things that people end up asking is, well, what can I do? What am I supposed to do? Okay, I understand that the world has all these problems, so I play the flute. What am I supposed to do? And so it's like, well, here is something that we can do. We can be thoughtful about how we're going to shape our curriculum. You can use your creativity to think about a composer you would like to engage, and then speak with that composer about what the level of the piece needs to be like, and you can work with your students to bring this music to life. So there are several other things that are happening at Juilliard in addition to that, but that's probably the most front of mind right now, because that's, we commissioned Allison Loggins Hull to write a piece for our flute auditions this year. So that was the first one. And then I was just having a conversation with Xavier Foley to write a piece for bass just a couple of days ago. And we're going to be ticking these off at a pretty fast clip here over the next few months.
That's amazing. Tony has a question.
Unmute there.
Hey, Tony, what's up, man?
How are you? I'm really glad you're doing this. And everything that I followed of yours so far, all these things that you're doing, it's like a very fresh delivery of stuff that we sort of know needs to happen. And, so I really appreciate that. I want to go back, if you don't mind, just a little bit about MAP. MAP was my first teaching gig at Juilliard, and I was teaching there for about 6 years. And I still say that is the best job I've ever had in my life, playing, teaching, I've done all sorts of stuff. But the thing about that job that I found really, really important was the mentoring aspect of it. And, I had 4 private clarinet students, and, we did all the clarinet stuff you're supposed to do. And I called them every week and all that. But I think about this one student, a boy from Mexico. His parents didn't speak English, and they had sort of janitorial jobs in Red Hook, Brooklyn. And he had an older sister who spoke English and a younger brother who only spoke Spanish. And so I took them on a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum, and we went to the instrument collection. And we went to look at some other collections as well. It was in the wintertime. And then I bought them lunch. And then I took them ice skating in Woolman Rink, right? They thought that those activities were only for rich white people. I explained to them they could go to the museum and pay a penny because they live in New York. They can go and do this because they felt like they didn't belong at all, right? And it was really distressing to me. And so I made a point of, at that time, because I was working in a lot of places, of using my salary from that gig to really focus on taking these kids and exposing them to things in addition to music, obviously, but other things in New York that they have every right to participate in. And the community they lived in, they didn't have a music program. The music teacher had kids come in a half hour before if he had some beat up instruments that he got on eBay. I wish that orchestras and music schools would require their orchestra members, and the schools would require all of their students to, do time working in these communities, but there need to be free instruments, there needs to be free lessons, there needs to be ensemble rehearsal opportunities for them, and there needs to be mentorship on a regular basis. And I never understood why, full-time orchestra jobs didn't make that part of, their scene, the whole reason why they're out there. And I played in the Met Opera Guild. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but they used to have a 28-piece orchestra. And we used to do these operas, and they would bus these kids in from these neighborhoods that had no music, and they would do it in English. Barbara of Seville and Don Pasquale and, Johnny Skiki. The kids were in hysterics. They ate it up. They really loved this. I just don't understand why there's not more of that, but why it's not required. Is this something that's on your radar is my question, really. And how does this happen? How do we get people with checkbooks to agree to buy into the importance of instruments, mentorship, lessons, ensembles? That's my question.
It's a great question. I think orchestras writ large have not historically thought of themselves as the educational space. And that's perhaps problematic, or it's definitely problematic. And when I say orchestras haven't thought of themselves that way, I think of that both as the managements of orchestras and the personnel of orchestras. I remember, and I won't call anyone out by name, but I taught in the music advancement program for 8 years. I think I started 2007 or 2008, if I remember correctly. And one day I was on an elevator in Juilliard. It was Saturday morning because MAP and pre-college are both Saturday programs. And being in the Met, you'd play a show on Friday until midnight because opera is long. And then you'd be in the building at 8 o'clock in the morning to teach your 4 lessons for MAP at 8, 9, 10, and 11. You'd be done at 12. Then you're running across the street to grab a quick lunch and then play the matinee at the Met. At any rate, I remember I was on the elevator and I had my trombone in my back and I was kind of in a rush. And someone else that I saw that was on the faculty at that time said, "So what are you doing for the rest of the day?" And I said, "I have to go play a show at the Met." They said, "You play in the Met?" I said, "Yeah." And that person said to me, "Then why are you teaching MAP?" That was just very jarring for me. It was the idea that like people who play at a certain level should not naturally have an inclination to want to teach, much less teach at a more intermediate student level, like that's beneath us somehow. But I think what was shared with me that day is representative of how a lot of people feel about the education space, which I think is unfortunate. I think it's one of the reasons why we have these issues with inclusion and belonging, because a lot of people who play in a world-class orchestra or a great string quartet or whatever it happens to be thinks, I've come too far and achieved too much to deal with teaching students who are still trying to figure out whatever it happens to be, how to put their instrument together. They don't have all their scales memorized yet. I'm too good for this. And I think that's one of the failures of the industry. And I'm hoping that all the things that have happened over the course of the last year are going to help reframe this for people and reframe this for institutions, because I think a lot of institutions are going to struggle mightily if they don't find a way to be more involved in this space. And if they don't find a way to be more involved in this space in a way that is actually symbiotic. So it's one thing, the last thing that students from communities with underrepresented, people who are historically underrepresented in classical music, or people who are underserved by the government or don't have what they need. The last thing they need is for someone to just like bring them in and let them see something awesome once and then tell them to go back home, never to see it again. It's like, it's very, very nice, but it's not actually helpful in some ways. Sometimes it just makes people feel like, okay, that's cool. That's what happens on the other side of town. That's not really for me. I guess I'm glad I saw it, but what does that do with me? One of the things I've always thought to myself is, if you want people to come to your stuff, you have to go to their stuff. It's like just a basic human principle. And I remember last year, back when we were in person, I started making these trips where I would go to like the Washington Heights Inwood Community Music Charter School or Bloomingdale Music School, or wherever it happened to be. And I would find out about what they were doing, and I would show up and I would go, and I would watch a concert of first graders and second graders, and it was cacophonous and they were disorganized and it was beautiful. And people would ask me who I was, and I was like, I'm a dean at Juilliard. And they're like, well, why are you here? I'm like, because I'm interested in what you're doing. And they were just, that created cognitive dissonance for them. They were shocked. They're like, really? Are you like BSing me right now? I'm like, no, like, let me know when the next thing is. I'm going to come to it because I think this is really cool. And you know what? You all should come to Juilliard sometime on Saturday and check out what we're doing. And because the invitation was really authentic, people were into coming. And now every Thursday night at 5:30, we have our pre-college head of percussion, Pablo Repi, who leads a group of pre-college students and MAP students, and they practice with 4 or 5 third and fourth graders from the Washington Heights Inwood Community Music Charter School every Thursday night on Zoom. And they do this for like 30, 45 minutes, and they've been doing this every night for probably the last 15, 16 weeks. And it's great, and the kids are sharing ideas, and it's a really beautiful symbiotic relationship. It's not one of those things where it's like the Metropolitan Opera or the New York Philharmonic or the Juilliard School or whoever needs to check a box and suggest that we are involved in this space. So can we bus all of you in for a couple of hours, have you go to the concert, and then we can tell our foundational supporters that we're involved in this space? Or are we actually doing something where there's a real benefit to both groups? So yeah, those are my immediate thoughts about that. I think there's going to be, when we return from this pandemic and we're actually able to return to some degree of normalcy, I'm hopeful that there's going to be a new frame where audience members and funders alike are going to say, the way that things were before, we were serving a very limited segment of customers. If we're like going business school on this, it's not really acceptable to me anymore. I think we should be doing a little bit better than that. And hopefully some of the musicians will recognize that too, because oftentimes, and I can say this as someone who's been on a negotiating committee multiple times for a major orchestra, oftentimes it's very easy to be like, it's all management's fault if they would do it. But I can tell you, there are a lot of musicians who are historically not into doing this work either. And so the change needs to come from that side also. It's going to take everybody. So I think I saw Jonathan and then Gilles.
Thank you. I'm really interested in the thread that you've been talking about in regards to belonging, both in the orchestra and also in an educational context. It sounds like you were also talking about just now in terms of people not believing that maybe you were interested in what they're doing, or that they would be welcome in your place. And so I guess I'm curious about, in your estimation or experience, what goes into creating a kind of environment that feels positive and like a place where anybody is welcome, and not just welcome like guest style welcome, but truly welcome as a member of belonging, in that kind of deep way.
Sure. Belonging has always been one of the ones that's more difficult to define. You know, we talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and I'll just go quickly through those. Diversity is bean counting. So, you know, like if we look at our screen and we see I have a white person, a Latino person, an Asian person, and a Black person. Okay, we have diversity because, and we have female representation, LGBTQ. We're diverse now because we can say that various groups are represented. So that's the diversity part. The equity part is the part where you could actually filter for things on a spreadsheet. Like I think that equity is something that can be very clearly defined. So if we said, all right, me and Jonathan and Rami and Elizabeth all hold a very similar position in our organization. Now, if we filter for that, are Black people being paid the same? Are Asian females being paid the same? That if we can look at things like that and we could say, all right, now we know that our institution is equitable. If we wanted to go down the inclusion part, we would say to ourselves, okay, we recognize that we have everyone represented because we just went through that series of groups. But if we were to break this down by level of the organization, we were to look at people who are on senior staff and artistic directors and all the way down to people who are, you know, on janitorial staff and everything in between or whatever, however you want to label that hierarchy. Is there similar representation at every level of the organization? Is this really inclusive from top to bottom? That's the inclusion piece. And then the belonging piece is the one that's a little less tactically, or yeah, it's a little bit more difficult to define from a tactile way. But one of the best frames that I've heard is Emily Stile, who created the National Seed Project. Just the concept of mirrors and windows, I think, is very valuable. The idea that when you go into a space or when you engage with curriculum, which is what she was talking about, that you have a mirror in which you can see yourself and a window in which you can see into the lives of others. And I think that's the beginning of creating a space of belonging. When you can walk into a space, you can go like, oh, look at all these cool people who come from all these different walks of life. That's really, really interesting. And I can learn a lot from that. And I can feel comfortable because there's other people like me here too. And that means not only are you allowed in a space, you know, it's not like, okay, we're fine with letting others come into our space, but others can be in our space and be authentically who they are. They don't feel like they have to check their personality or their humanity or try to not be too Black or too this or whatever in their space, but they get to be exactly who they are. And people are not begrudging in their acceptance of that. To me, that's the belonging piece. So, you know, there's any number of different trainings and stuff like that go into teaching us about belonging in different ways that we oftentimes accidentally trample on other people's feelings and people's comfort in a certain space. But I think that's largely what the belonging piece is. Can people be their most authentic selves and be graciously accepted into a space? Gio?
Thanks. I wanted to ask you about something that's been on my mind also, because it has to do with how I grew up as a student. And it actually has to do a little bit with Anthony McGill, because, you know, I operate mostly in the chamber music world, and it was obvious to us that he was an incredible musician. He is an incredible musician. And I just want to talk about, you know, when I look at, you know, the leadership that was in charge, if you can think of this kind of thing in classical music, whether that's administration or boards, which, you know, I've sat in front of some boards, it's almost always older white people, right? With occasionally like a very notable exception that really sticks out just because, you know. And so I remember, you know, Anthony McGill also stuck out in the chamber music world, you know, And in 2009, he played for the Obama inauguration. And that was incredible. And in the back of my head, I thought, okay, now they're really going to make a big deal out of this, because it's like obvious. This is great, And there was nothing. There's more of an announcement at the Met specifically. There'll be more chance of someone coming out saying that Anna Netrebko is feeling not great tonight, but she's going to sing anyway. Then you're going to hear that we have someone in the orchestra who just played for the inauguration. So now we have basically the same leadership as we did in the late 2000s, and now we have a Terence Blanchard opera opening the season. And and now we have incredible interest in exposure. Of underrepresented communities on stage, right? As much as possible, it feels like. To what extent, I thought if you just had are we seeing change, meaningful change? Will it take a long time to know that answer? Because it seemed to me, even as a student, I have a different perspective now. It just seemed obvious to me that there was something being missed. So I guess, like, how should we hold people accountable? Also, these boards, you sit there in front of these boards and they say, we need more diversity. They're all old white people, like, who are saying this, like, so what do we
I have a couple thoughts. So the board piece we'll start with the board piece. One of the traditional things is there's a financial barrier to entry on a board, oftentimes, not always, but a lot of times. I'm pretty sure, and I don't know all the details of it because I'm not in the leadership structure at the Metropolitan Opera, but I know at certain level, I believe that at certain levels of the Met board, there's a minimum required give every year to do that. And I think that's pretty high. And I think it's very telling about who's allowed to be in your club and how you define value. Because I would think that a board is not only about giving money, but also making sure that the customers that or the communities that you're trying to reach are represented and have a voice on your board, regardless of how much money they can give. Granted, I understand that money is a very important element of making nonprofit organizations run. You need to have donors, and people are not likely to give you $1 million or $10 million if they also get zero say. But what this really boils down to is, are people willing to part ways with some degree of power? That's all it is. Someone who gives $500,000 a year, $5 million a year, are they willing to say, I'm open to giving someone even some small share of the power and the decision making because they're from a community that we're trying to reach? And then that brings up the second question. Is that a community that you're actually trying to reach? Not so sure about that. I think in many ways, a lot of the organizations currently serve the populations that they want to serve. They may oftentimes say that they aim to serve different constituency groups because it's the appropriate thing to say and it sounds good. But if you look at where they spend their money, who they allow to have authority within their organization, or even any degree of decision-making power within their organization, or if you look at their budget and think of the budget as a moral document that helps to show how much you invest in certain places, you'll find the answers there. So that's to me, that's part of the board piece, is what qualifies someone to be on a board. Is it only financial? Or is it any number of other things? And so that's that. As far as, oh gosh, what was your other question? You had another one. It was about, are we seeing real change? that was the question. I think that's very much to be determined. The nation is having this incredible reckoning on racial justice. And I think every organization is feeling pressure to demonstrate that they're aware of that, whether that's from their normal patrons and audience members, or whether that's from foundations that have traditionally given them money and have changed what their requirements are for giving funds. But I think every organization in America that's even remotely in touch is going to be making changes in this upcoming year and trying to demonstrate something. What remains is whether that's going to be tokenization or whether it's going to be long term. And I'm very curious about that. And so I'm actually more impressed with the organizations that were having this conversation in a real serious way and making real changes prior to George Floyd. And I'm curious to see which ones 5 or 6 years from now will still be doing that work. I think that's going to be the difference. And I actually think that's going to be a big difference as far as whether or not those organizations are successful or not. A lot of boards think, well, we don't want to be too risky, so let's continue to program this small cohort of composers. And I think that's actually just a massive blind spot, that they're missing out on the opportunity to engage a lot more people by doing things quite a bit differently. So I actually, there are all these little blips on the radar that everyone is aware of in music that I actually don't get too caught up into. After the murder of George Floyd, every organization was trying to make their statement. How do we put all the right words together to say that we believe that Black Lives Matter without being cringeworthy or accidentally saying the wrong thing? Or what should we put on our next program? Or for this upcoming season, should we do only Black composers, or should we start the season with a Black composer like the Metropolitan Opera is doing, or whatever it happens to be, And then there's the other organizations that have slip ups and they have some gaffe, where it's like, I won't name it, but I'm sure you all know it. Like, an organization puts out a poster for a recital and it's like, oh my God, we made a huge mistake there, and what does that mean for our organization and what we stand for and all those other things. Actually, don't get too caught up in all of that, because my response is, it's not really about what you do in one small segment of time. It's really about what are you doing every single day and what are you going to be doing 5 years from now? 5 years from now, no one is going to be thinking about the Black Lives Matter statement that an organization made on whatever date it was. What they're going to be looking at is, over the course of the last 5 years, what have you actually done? That to me is the stuff that matters. So that's what I'm paying attention to. I think the jury's still out on which organizations want to make a statement and which organizations really want to do something that's sustainable. So, see Felipe and Sue.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question is more about the educational part of things, because I think there's a lot of ways in which people teach and which people learn, and sometimes they're really tied to their communities and their backgrounds, and sometimes the music they're exposed to, or the way they are exposed to that music. So I think that can be met, in terms of equity and opportunity on a small level, the relationship, as you were saying, between the teacher and the student. But obviously there's lots of larger issues with, trying to convince institutions to change the way they've been doing things for a long, long time, and that has been working for most students, but not all. Or what are your thoughts about that kind of situation? And how would you say, where do we go from here? Because I think things are changing quite a bit. It's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, I mean, I think change is going to take some time. We have to manage the pace of change. Personally, I like to go very, very fast because, but I have to check that against the reality of, everyone is at a different place in the conversation, and you have to respect that while simultaneously pushing people to move forward. And I think the change has to come as a result of education, and education takes time. And when I say education, I'm not just saying like, what is the curriculum, but also, for example, educating your students, but also educating your faculty. Because I can tell you, I mean, I've been on faculties for years and years now myself, and it's very easy to get into a groove, where I know that all of my freshmen are required to learn these pieces, and my sophomores this, and juniors that, and seniors, and for grad recitals, we do these types of things. And you can get kind of tied to your top 30 or 40 pieces that upside down and backwards, and you can teach those. And then someone comes and says, I want you teacher X who's been teaching at a really high level for the last 20 years to really thoughtfully think about a whole bunch of different repertoire that you don't know and start also teaching that. And it's like, the response is like, well, I've been teaching, hide and seek since forever, and I'm good with that, and my students are employed and doing well, so why do I need to invest this amount of time? So part of that is getting people to recognize, actually, you're missing out on a lot of really good music. So this is not just that we're going to check a box and have a quota where it's like, I need you to teach a piece by a Black composer. It's like, actually, you should go, speaking clarinet, you should go listen to this Samuel Coleridge-Taylor clarinet quintet. It's actually a really freaking good piece, And when you listen to that, you'll start thinking to yourself, why do I not know this, and why am I not teaching this? And if I'm supposed to be a world-class teacher of this art form, I need to shore up all these blind spots, because you can't, for example, you can't be a history teacher and just suddenly say, I'm going to cut out those 50 years of history and not teach that. So once people start recognizing what they're missing, that's one of the starts. And if you're simultaneously getting students exposed to that also, a lot of changes in institutions are going to happen faster when they come from the students and from the faculty. Because the students are the customers, and the faculty and the institution need those customers, for one, and that's where the learning is going. That's where everything generates. Even before I had this position, when I was teaching at other institutions, and I recognized that there were things that needed to change, I always found the fastest way to get those things to change was to tell the students to start complaining about it. So when they started complaining about it, because if students think it's really important for me to learn a diverse and inclusive set of repertoire, and I recognize this teacher is not really teaching that, I don't want to study with that teacher anymore. I want to study with this other person who actually knows the whole repertoire. And then suddenly this teacher figures out, why did my studio just go from 10 players to 4? It's going to move, So I think that's part of how we address the music education space. Sua, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, you are. Hi, Weston. Thank you so much for taking your time to come and talk to us today. I was thinking about what you said with how traditionally orchestras aren't concerned with education. I thought that was kind of funny because, well, they kind of were, but they were concerned with educating a certain upper class white Europeans. But you sort of answered my question with this idea of exchange between communities and going from exchanging between places. But I was wondering what you thought about the space of the place and the space that that orchestras occupy in general, and if you're thinking of not only this physical space, but also the kind of repertoire that orchestras have been traditionally playing by old dead male white composers primarily. I was wondering if you're thinking of this more as like a reclamation process, like reclaiming the space, or that's my question.
I think it's just about making the whole picture known. That if you're going to be an orchestra, play all of the good repertoire, not just some of it. I mean, I've heard people say we should cancel Beethoven or something like that. I think my personal opinion is that's crazy. I love Beethoven. I want to hear it every year for sure. I probably want to hear it like every couple of weeks, honestly. I think it's, I love these pieces. I came to love classical music on Mahler and Strauss and Beethoven and Brahms and stuff like that. I mean, I love all of this work, but I'm kind of saddened by the fact that a lot of these great pieces of repertoire are relatively new to me, and I'm 38 years old now. If, what I was taught in music school about Black people's history in classical music is that it didn't really exist. And if I think back to when I was 17 years old and I was a freshman at Indiana University, and the first day of school, we had these orchestral placement auditions. From behind the screen, there's like 50 trombone players because Indiana is a huge music school. And I got first chair in the top ensemble. So I'm like, okay, I'm the strongest trombone player at this huge school. And if someone had come up to me that day and said, Weston, you're this very accomplished young musician, can you tell me 2 or 3 composers in all of classical music history who are Black? I would have been completely lost. But I would have simultaneously been thought of as someone who is on the pathway to success while simultaneously being completely ignorant. And I think that's just tragic. I'm glad that I've been able to change the narrative for myself over the course of time. But I think that's one of the things that orchestras, but not just orchestras are just like an easy go-to, but musicians from all different walks of life, whether you're a soloist or a chamber musician, orchestra musician, you play Broadway or you do movie gigs or whatever. There's a number of ways to make a living playing classical music. But all of us just to be aware of all that's there. Because if we're not aware of what's there, how can we going back to that mirrors and windows frame, how can we bring other people into that space also? Because to kind of shift topic a little bit, it's about what do we view as being relevant. Like if we were to go to a community of Latin Americans, a Mexican American community, for example, why is the music that we play relevant for them? It can't just be because, well, of course it's Beethoven, it's amazing. Sure, it is. I mean, I know that, and I have that frame, but a lot of them probably don't. And it doesn't mean that they can't over time adopt that same frame also, but there has to be some type of entry point or there has to be some type of on-ramp for people to even want to listen to you in the first place. And oftentimes that on-ramp is that people can see themselves in what you're doing. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, but there's this thing called it's called the matrix of oppression. And I find it to be very interesting because, it talks about, it basically frames the people who are the least oppressed on one end and the people who are the most oppressed on the other end. And so at the top left-hand corner of that, you might have tall, white, male, rich, Christian, straight, so on and so forth, right? And at the bottom right-hand of that corner of that, you might have short, Black, female, Muslim, gay, whatever. All of the reasons why people are discriminated against and put in that bottom corner. And what you will find, or what this basically demonstrates, is that people who are in the top left-hand corner oftentimes have a very difficult time having a connecting point to people who are on the other end of that spectrum. Because there are so few places in their own life where they've felt any degree of oppression that it's hard for them to find their way. And when I find there's a gap between me and someone else with regards to equity, diversity, and inclusion, oftentimes one of the first things I'll do is I'll scan and think, where does this person fall on this? Where is the entryway that I can connect with this person so they can understand what I'm talking about? And usually if you can find that entry point, people go like, oh, I get it, But if you take that back and you think about the repertoire discussion or how you engage with different communities, the first way to engage with a new group of people are people who didn't grow up listening to classical music and don't just love it just because, is find some space for them to actually be able to connect with it. It's kind of like maybe a particular piece or a particular relationship that they have with the background of a composer that they're able to that you're able to share with them actually serves as the gateway for them to also be able to appreciate all the other things that we have to offer. But if we don't even know those things ourselves, then how can we possibly do that? So I think that's something that we should all be thinking about. And I think that's why, being really deep into this conversation and understanding what's going on out there is going to actually it's going to be beneficial to everybody. It's not just better for other people, it's better for us. It's going to make us smarter, more knowledgeable musicians, and it's going to make more people want to come to our concerts and engage with our craft.
Tony had another question.
Thanks, Liz. This teaching via Zoom has been challenging for all of us. Coaching chamber music groups, as you can imagine, is a total nightmare.
Thank you for doing it, by the way.
Oh, but I'm enjoying it. I found a way to enjoy it, and I'll tell you why. When we had that conversation at the beginning of the year about inclusivity and diversity, I wasn't sure how to approach it with what I teach at Juilliard. And so, when the suggestion was made to perhaps alternate weeks, 1 week kids play, another week there's maybe a sort of a seminar type of a situation, that's what worked for me. And so what I've done, and Weston, you know a little bit about this, but I guess I want to share with other people. So 1 week, the assignment, they would play, and then I say, okay, next week I want you to do research of chamber music written by Black composers, period. And they each had to come up with 5 or more. And they had to be pieces that they liked and that they would want to play. And they really got into this. And I mean, the list is very long, but as you said, for a clarinet player to say, how did I not know about Samuel Coleridge Taylor's clarinet quintet, right? How come I didn't know this existed? And so we had a conversation about that. But learning about all of these Black composers with doctorate degrees and commissions by major symphony orchestras, yet we don't know them and we haven't played the music. So the kids having these conversations, it was really great. The next assignment after that was female composers and kids finding, and again, it was chamber music. It had to have your instrument in the group, right? But finding out that there was a Polish composer during World War II who was part of the resistance, and her music could only be played in somebody's basement so that the authorities wouldn't hear her doing this sort of risky stuff. Another week was Latinx composers, and we did Asian composers and everybody else. I don't know what that means, but I encouraged Pacific Islanders and Indian, and they've really embraced this project and they've learned a lot. But I've learned a lot too. I mean, I did my share of the research as well. But what we've learned is that there is a lot of good music that should be part of the rotation, right? Yes, we still have to play Reich quintet. I've been doing that my whole life. I'm kind of over the Opus 88, number 2 in E flat major, right? But it's an important piece to learn for a specific reason. But there's no reason why, William Grant Still wrote a couple of pieces. Valerie Coleman has written a number of excellent wind quintets. Paquito de Rivera. I mean, there's some really decent repertoire out there that needs to be part of the rotation. But having the students do that work is way more effective than if I just say, okay, we're going to do this piece now that I found, right? For them to do the research and discover the piece and the composer for themselves, way more meaningful than if I say, let's play this piece now, let's work on this piece. And I think as teachers, I think that kind of an approach, having the students do that work to find something and bring it to you, or bring a couple of options to you and then decide together what to work on, I think it's a great way to approach this, because like anything, there's good music and bad music out there, right? But we really want to look at, there's a lot of good, and it's just missing terribly from what we do as teachers. But having the students do that work, for me anyway, has really shown me that they take a huge interest in this, and it's something that will stay with them, right? They keep these lists for themselves, and so this is something they can draw on. And they've even included, sonatas for their instrument and piano or unaccompanied works. It's been a good process. So the Zoom has been okay for that, I have to say. I've appreciated it.
I was going to say, Tony, what you're doing with your classes there is you're basically creating this sense of contagion. And I'm excited about, 10 years from now, when those kids are graduating from college and becoming professionals, students who kind of came into this understanding of this is what the repertoire is when they're 13 to 17 years old, or however old they all are, they don't know anything different, which is beautiful, which means our world is going to be different shortly. 5-10 years from now, when you suddenly have all of these hotshot young players coming out and they know all of this repertoire and they've been groomed to understand it. So I think that's really beautiful. I think from a faculty perspective, even though I've been pushing very hard in this space of EDI, I don't claim to be an expert on the repertoire. I'm going through the same process that a lot of people are going through, learning a lot of new repertoire. I mean, I had a point early this year where I was just ordering all the music I could find for trombone that's by Black composers and Latin composers and female composers, et cetera, and just have it on my stand. I just play through stuff, all the time and figure out what's good. And I found it felt like being a student again, which was great. It's just, so for everyone who hasn't gone through that process yet, I would encourage you all to do it because it's really, really fun. I mean, there are only so many times you can hear certain pieces and they still have that same freshness. Things. I even tell students a lot of times when they're getting ready to play a concert, especially if it's the first time they've ever played a piece. You hear a youth orchestra or something, you say, have you ever played Mahler 1 before? And I think about that because it's a very common youth orchestra piece. And they're like, no, I've never played it. And I'm like, well, you should really, really enjoy it because it's only the first time once. It really is only the first time one time. The 10th time you play it, it will still be a great piece, but it won't be the same. And I think all of us as people who are a little bit more experienced get to kind of have that rebirth and that excitement of what it's like to experience pieces for the first time and to experience really, really good pieces for the first time. It's been a lot of fun for me to do that. Lauren?
Hi, Weston. Thank you so much for everything that you've said. It's been comforting and really affirming to hear. I'm a part of the dance department here, the dance program here, and I'm wondering what you think about the intersection of music and dance, how important it is to music curriculum and everything in between. What have you found in your classes and in your work in New York?
The intersection of dance has not been incredibly prominent in the preparatory division just yet, even though I think there are going to be some intersections. Of course, there's a lot of intersections between dance and music historically. I know at Juilliard we have a course called ChoreoComp, which students have been going through for years and years and years, where composition majors get together with dancers and help to create new works, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And Juilliard is really big on intersectionality. So I think you have to make sure that both art forms are really informing each other and that we're not just doing collaboration for the sake of collaboration. It's not just if you put everybody on stage at the same time, it's going to be awesome. It has to be really, really thoughtful in the way that you do it. But I think the idea of excellence is transferable between the different art forms. And I think there are things that we can learn from each other in a lot of different ways. So this past summer, we had Alicia Graf Mack, who I'm sure you know of because she's Dean and Director of our dance division at Juilliard, come and work with our students on, D-Man in the Waters. And she taught all of them the choreography to the first movement of the Mendelssohn Octet. And I think it was just a window for our students. Like, I didn't even know that this was a thing, and this is really cool. And now I'm interested in this other art form, and I see how it can relate to the music that I'm playing. I mean, we have a lot of students. We did a class on Rite of Spring. I think a lot of students don't, when they're 15 years old, they don't have any relationship to what that has to do with dance at all, or Firebird, or any of these pieces. And a lot of what we end up trying to push to get taught in our program, at least in the prep division, is based on when I rewind my own personal life and I think about all the gaps that were in my education. I think how could we fill those for kids now? Another thing is it's not dance direct, but we've had but it's movement. I think Delcros has a lot of elements of movement, which has been really useful for our students. MAP program this year, we had all of our students take a class called Movement, Music, and Rhythm for the first 7 weeks, which I think really helped students get a more tactile understanding of how to feel rhythm because of body percussion and movement. I grew up in Texas, and so I think one of the reasons why I've always been stronger on the rhythmical side and I was able to get my excerpts in time with the metronome is because I grew up in marching band and I was able to put something tactile with movement with my music, which is really, really valuable. And I think it cuts the other way also. I think there's a lot of benefit to dancers from understanding what's happening from a musical perspective. And you probably also know Damien Wetzel, who's president of Juilliard, is the first ever dancer to be the president of Juilliard. So, you know, dance has a very prominent space at the Juilliard School. And I'm looking forward to seeing the way that we can have even more and more collaborations moving forward, because a lot of the things that I've enjoyed the most, we're playing in a ballet orchestra, also just going to see different dance things. Like when I saw, oh my gosh, Spaces with Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, all of these things, it's really beautiful. And I think our students just need to be aware of what it is. So for us at the early age, because we don't have a pre-college dance program, we don't have a pre-college drama program or a pre-college jazz program, right now we're working in the space of awareness.
Thank you so much, Weston. I think this could go on for a long time, but we probably should wrap it up now. And thank you so much. This has been an especially great evening.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. Great to meet all of you and hear so many of your questions. And I hope that some of the things that I said were useful to you.
Definitely. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Very good. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Great, Liz.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for coming.